If not for a pandemic, this might have been a big, exciting year for the Toronto Transit Commission. It turns 100. But throughout the COVID crisis, ridership plummeted, operating costs didn't, and it faced some real staffing challenges. Can Canada's largest public transit system find ways to bring people back in a post-COVID recovery that may include very different commuting patterns? Let's find out from our guests, all of them in the provincial capital. At her office at City Hall, there's Toronto City Councillor and TTC Commissioner Shelley Carroll. In the annex, Shoshanna Saxe, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering at the U of T and the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Infrastructure. And on the Danforth, longtime transit activist Steve Munro, who blogs at the website stevemunro.ca. And it's great to have you three on our program tonight. Shelley Carroll, I'll start with you. How well, in your judgment, was the TTC serving the Greater Toronto Area before the pandemic hit?
Well, people may have forgotten, but before we were well over capacity, really crowding riders in. Most of the complaints were that while fares were going up, we didn't seem to be buying vehicles fast enough, and so we were at capacity in the bus system, in the streetcar system, and the subway system.
Steve Munro, we know that ridership has dropped drastically because of the pandemic. How much of it has come back in the interim?
Well, it went down to about a quarter of its usual height on the TTC, more so on the subway than on the bus system. It's now come back to 45 to 55%, depending on where you are. The curves have been trending upward recently, which is certainly nice to see. But the important thing is that we don't assume the TTC ain't dead yet. Is I would say the watchword. We have to look at this as something that we waited out. People will come back to transit once they're working again, once they're back at school again, once all the entertainment venues are back again.
Well, we'll get into that as we go along here. Shoshanna Saxe, in your view, why have the numbers, the jobs have all come back. Why have the numbers of people riding on the Toronto Transit system not come back to 100% capacity?
A lot of people are still working from home, and a lot of people are still scared to be in crowded environments. Those are things that will ease up with time.
What do you think it would take to get people to be less nervous about riding on a streetcar or a bus or a subway?
I think less COVID would help. More enforcement of the mask mandate, more universal vaccination, and more time.
Well, let's talk about the mask mandate for a second. Shelley Carroll, I know that, whenever I'm on the subway, it really is dependent on people adhering to the honor system. You haven't got lots of people running around on the buses or on the subways or in the streetcars telling people to put their masks on. We sort of are required to police ourselves. Do you think you need to use a stronger hand in that regard?
Well, that may be the case. If we should see another wave, a fifth wave, I think we may have to look at that. We are relying on the honor system to a great extent, though, because we're really struggling with that reduced ridership that Steve described. And so we don't want to take the money that's been provided by other orders of government just to keep the system running at near to 100% and then funnel it all into enforcement. At the same time, we don't want to put the operators, the drivers running the system, at risk. And so we're really counting on the community to behave like a community and keep each other safe. And we just hope that at every juncture, wherever this is discussed and whenever it's discussed, that yet more people realize we would all be safe if we just adhere to the mask mandate when we get on that vehicle.
Well, let's get Ben Spur into this. He's the transportation reporter of the Toronto Star, and he had this to say about this subject not too long ago. COVID-19 has fundamentally altered the demand for transit. According to TTC projections, for ridership to return to just 90% of pre-pandemic levels, the city's office occupancy rates will need to recover to 80% of normal. Universities and colleges return fully to in-person classes, and capacity limits on all retail and entertainment activities be fully lifted. The timetable for all those factors is uncertain, and for the foreseeable future, there will likely be fewer reasons for people to ride. Okay, Shoshanna, pick up that story there. Given all of what Ben just said, how big a problem is that for the long-term future of the TTC?
I don't think it's a problem at all. We do a really bad job as humans and understanding how long infrastructure lasts for. When we're talking about the future of the TTC, we should be talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now, in addition to 1 year from now and 5 years from now. Universities are already largely back in class downtown. They should expect to be even more back in class within not too long, unless there is another wave or another strain. All capacity limits on entertainment venues, I think, were lifted today. So things are changing really quickly, and I don't think we're processing how quickly things will continue to change.
Okay, that's a somewhat optimistic viewpoint. Shelley Carroll, what say you?
Well, I think we have another sort of potential to reach here. We were oversubscribed before. There were people avoiding the TTC because it was too crowded. What we have to do now is go beyond just an ad singing the song "Welcome Back" and really find a way to welcome back riders and to introduce new people to the system. As we come out of the pandemic, I think we have to incentivize them back. We have to look at our fare structure. We have to look at our schedules. And while we have this help from other orders of government to get to the end of the pandemic, use it to actually cultivate ridership and make sure that although our work lifestyles may be changing, that it's still our first choice mode of transportation.
Steve, can I get you to comment on the last line there in Ben Spur's piece, which is the timetable for all those factors is uncertain, and for the foreseeable future, there will likely be fewer reasons for people to ride. Agree or disagree?
Agree mostly. The big problem is that there are parts of the city that aren't back to normal. And if it's like when people talk about having stores nearby to walk to, if you're living in the middle of nowhere, there's no place 15 minutes away, as an example. That's a big idea these days, very transit and pedestrian oriented. But we have a situation where places people might go are not back fully operating again. The biggest of which, of course, is the office towers. Now, the office towers downtown might very well be used differently. People may work part weeks. The amount of floor space per worker may go down, but the total number of workers commuting may eventually level off or even grow if those towers have less space per worker, but more workers in the towers.
Well, Shelley Carroll, let me try this then. You know, we've got something on the TTC called a Metro Pass. At least I think it's still called a Metro Pass, which is a monthly, and it's a good deal.
Monthly pass.
Yeah, the monthly pass. And if you use it every day, it's a good deal. But if you've got people who are going to be coming to work only half of the week now instead of the full week now, do you have to rethink that?
We do need to rethink it because, in actual fact, pre-pandemic, it was not considered a good deal. In terms of North American systems, the number of rides over and above just going to work Monday through Friday were more rides than basically any other monthly pass in the North American transit network. We really need to look at that monthly pass. We're really trying to incentivize. I would submit that we need to get down to a point of welcoming people back for a set period, perhaps for 6 months, whatever. We need to make it just going to work Monday through Friday is your monthly pass cost, and that will bring people back. That's a way of getting them back in the habit of choosing transit over Uber, transit over catching a ride here and there, but also because for people who may be taking the odd day per month to work from home, that seems to be the hybrid that some people are working to, 2 days a month, 3 days a month, you work from home. If that's the new model, then we need to account for it in the monthly pass. And the best time to do it is right now when other orders of government are funding us to run almost 100% service. That means that it's not really a loss of revenue to offer a discount on this pass, particularly not if it generates sales of those passes.
Shoshanna, how do you like that idea?
I think that the cost of taking the TTC is important, but it's not the most important thing I'd like to see us be ambitious about in the future. There has been decades of research on why do people ride transit, and cost is important, so it's something we should be paying attention to. But the number one thing is, does it go where you need to go when you need it to go there. And this is something that has been a challenge with the TTC from before the pandemic. It was a challenge during the pandemic, and it'll be a challenge after the pandemic. And so I'd like to also see us be really ambitious about service and where people can go quickly on the TTC. Things that we've talked about in the past, like rapid bus transit routes. I think that's going to be really important for the future. And it's not just about reestablishing what we had before, but about establishing something that's better. If people are going to be working in different ways, that doesn't mean they'll be taking less trips. It means they'll be taking trips to different places. We want to make sure the TTC goes there as well.
Well, let's take Shoshanna's advice here and not look to next month, but let's look to the next decade and beyond. And to that end, the Ontario government expects the Greater Toronto Area to grow in population by, if you can believe this, more than 40% over the next quarter century. That's about 1 million more people in the City of Toronto alone. And the roads of the City of Toronto, if you've driven them lately, and I suspect most people watching this in the city have, well, they're obviously not going to be able to accommodate that kind of population growth. So, Steve, in your judgment, how prepared is the TTC to move potentially a good chunk of that many more people?
I think they're not prepared, but it's not just the TTC. Part of it is the city and the priority it gives to transit, both in terms of road space, but also, frankly, in terms of funding. One of the big problems we have is the idea that that buses have to be full everywhere. I mean, that's the attitude some politicians take, and frankly, you cannot have that all the time on every route, and also have everywhere to everywhere service. We have to get away from the model that basically we're moving people to King and Bay, but we're moving people over much wider ranges. And in some cases, the bus isn't going to be packed to the roof. That's going to cost money. Councillor
Carroll, you agreeing with that?
I do. We just heard Shoshanna saying what most riders say. It's gotta be an everywhere to everywhere service, and then it will always be by choice. Then I start from, can I get there by the TTC? That's my first thing that I look at. And let's face it, there will be 1 million more people. They're already coming in and or growing into the people who need homes and ways to get to work and jobs. And so what we have to do is get to the point where we understand that prioritizing transit by allowing transit to use more of our roads is because we don't have more roads. And what we want is to get people to make a choice to opt out of car usage, even if it's only a certain number of days a week. We want them to opt out of their cars and onto the transit system. And in that way, we'll be able to accommodate that increased population on the roads we have. Right now, what we're living through is a lot of people who have the choice, but they're choosing car because they're still nervous about the system. And that's been a real eye-opener for us. It really has confirmed for us that it's not a system that transports just the carless. It's transporting people who have the options and they chose transit for a long time. Now we need to get them to choose it again.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Councillor Carroll, because if you're looking at a couple going out for the evening, for example, or certainly if it's a family, it can be much more economically advantageous to take an Uber or even drive yourself than to take the TTC. How does the TTC compete with that scenario?
Well, it's one of the things that we have been looking at. I moved a motion at the Commission recently to approach ridership growth in the context of we have this new competitor, which is ride sharing. We have to recognize that Uber has begun to take care of some of the short trips. I think it's part of the reason that you see as the pandemic starts to near its end, the bus system is very full, but the core city and the higher order transit, where people can take a short Uber trip from one downtown location to another, that's very compelling to them. And so what we have to do is make this a high quality service, as convenient as possible, and really make it their first choice. And a lot of that is looking at the fare medium, which we're doing right now. I would submit that we need to look at the fare structure. We're also doing a 5-year fare structure review right now. These are all things in the long run, over the next decade, can really start to drive choice to take this system.
Steve, let me ask you about that, the fare structure, which is, One of the unique selling propositions, I guess you could put it that way, for the TTC is that whether you're going one stop on a subway or you're going from the southwest end of Etobicoke to the northeast end of Scarborough, it's the same fare. That can be both a plus and a minus. Do you think that unique selling proposition is worth hanging on to?
Yes, very much. As a matter of fact, one of the big changes, thinking of pre-pandemic times, when the MetroPass was introduced, it made a big difference for people who traveled frequently. The MetroPass basically set a fixed price per month, although it was high compared to other cities. It set a fixed price. More recently, we have the 2-hour transfer, which is like a mini MetroPass. You can get on and get off without having to worry about arcane rules of whether or not you pay a fare. Those are both very important in terms of not kind of nickel and diming people as they go along. There has been talk of charging by distance, and I find that rather intriguing, considering that the very people for whom transportation is most a problem, that is to say, people who are lower wage earners who live far away from their jobs, would be hurt proportionately much more, whereas someone like me who lives downtown and makes short trips everywhere, actually fare by distance would be just great. Thank you.
Shoshanna, what's your view on that?
I think we're talking about only one half of the challenge, which is how much do we charge people to take the TTC? And there's another really big question, which is how much do we subsidize people to drive, which is a lot. So we can also talk about that subsidy, about prices for parking, about the discomfort of driving. I mean, often driving feels like it's going to be faster and cheaper if you look at the TTC fares and then you get in a car and it's miserable and you're stuck in traffic and there can't be anywhere to park. That needs to be part of the messaging of why the TTC is better. Going by rapid transit is faster and cheaper. And when people remember it's faster and cheaper, they take it more often. When we're talking about how to accommodate an extra 1 million people in Toronto and how we get them moving around, it's also a question of land use, of where do those people live? And so if we're putting all of this solely on the TTC, it's a lot of responsibility for only one part of the equation, when really the city should be looking at all of these things at the same time.
Understood. Shelley Carroll, I want to ask you the $12 billion question. And that is, if ridership doesn't come back the way that everybody either hopes or expects that it will, do we still need to spend $12 billion building that Ontario line from the northeast part down to the waterfront?
Well, I probably would have a different route underway to what the province has done. Our downtown relief line was going to serve almost the same purposes and was much further along in terms of study and ready to go. But that line is coming. And so I prefer to look at it in the reality. And there is always an ability to grow ridership. The question is, do you want to invest in doing that? And what we have just witnessed is an almost 2-year pilot now of what happens and what is the potential of a system when we get back to what we had long ago, if we go all the way back to the time of Premier Bill Davis, and that is other government partners in operating the system. That infusion has allowed us to keep going against all odds, against an employment crash and the pandemic itself. It's that infusion. Post-pandemic, we should be having a conversation with the federal government and the provincial government to say, look what was possible. Now, if we're going to get 1 million people here, we need you to stay on as an operating partner, not just a capital partner, because we need to grow the ridership so that you're not building that Ontario line for nothing. Help us make sure that we're getting people to choose their adult life to be a transit riding adult life, so that when you cut the ribbon on the Ontario line, that's the mode of travel they want.
Steve, I should get your take on that as well. Do we still need a $12 billion Ontario line if ridership doesn't come back? What do you think?
The Ontario line, or the relief line, or whatever you want to call it, is something we've needed for about 50 years, and it keeps getting pushed off the table for other projects. The only reason it wasn't built in the last few decades, it was a really hot topic in the late 80s when the subway was packed full. And then there was this little recession in the early 1990s, and all of a sudden we didn't need the relief line anymore. Well, not building it is not an option. And if anything, it doesn't go far enough. Stopping at Eglinton, well, that's nice as a first step. It should really go further north up Don Mills Road. I've always thought if it had been called the Don Mills Subway, it would have been built 20 years ago.
Shoshanna Saxe, it's supposed to go from Don Mills down to the CNE. Do you think we still need it? It's a big price tag.
Absolutely. It's going to take at least a decade to build. We can't predict what the future is going to be like, but 100 years of evidence show the subway will come back. We're definitely going to need it, and we will regret not building it if we don't, just like we regret the last time we didn't build it. I think the question is, how do we make it a success? And that is about how we coordinate it with land use. This is something that Toronto used to be a world leader in, and we let that slide. When we built the Yonge line, we made sure that businesses and apartments and housing were built concentrated around the line. That's something I'd love to see around the Ontario line. It's unfortunately something we keep forgetting about, but we can retrofit that into our plans for any subway eventually if we can get our act together to remember what we used to be good at.
Well, speaking of coordination, let me follow up with Shelley Carroll on that. Coordination's a fabulous thing, but you at the city, I mean, I assume you can't really tell people where to work, where to live, where to play. How much influence can you have on those decisions? Because, of course, that very much depends on how much and where transit ought to be built.
Well, I'm a representative along the Sheppard Subway line. I have all but one of the stops on the Sheppard Subway. And it, quite frankly, is a shining example of what happens when you do actually, as our official plan says, prioritize a transit avenue. We have grown the population along the Sheppard line. And a line that was destined for failure actually has pretty decent ridership now. It also is beginning to take shape as a community. Its avenues are starting to become much more walkable. The retail is about to start to fill in. And that took 20 years. So you have to decide that that's what you're going to do and carry it forward. I think you're going to see a big change along the Eglinton Crosstown line, that provincial line. There are many, many applications all along its route in that say that that is where we're going to focus more residents, more employment, and really make sure that that line, once built, is viable. But that being said, we also have to take into account that people have to be able to afford to live close to that transit. And to that end, the city is right now engaged in a deep conversation about inclusionary zoning so that not only will have the transit there for riders, hopefully the jobs, but we need to make it so that that's true for everyone, not just the CEO.
Steve, I should ask you about the Eglinton Crosstown. It's going in about, I don't know, a couple of 100 meters north of where I'm sitting right now. It's, what's the last price tag on it? $5.5, $6 billion line. How do you see it transforming the transit opportunities in this city?
I think it can be very good. I really do hope that the eastern part of it out to Kingston Road and up to University of Toronto Scarborough isn't deferred forever, because that was an important part of the original Eglinton project. But the thing we have to, I'm going to come back to the issue with bus services, and that is that we keep focusing on an individual line, an individual corridor. It's not something that you can do where, Eglinton will fix everything. It won't. There will still be huge parts of the city where the only thing they will ever see is buses. And it's imperative that the TTC do a better job of running bus service, which they frankly are not doing as good a job as they could right now. People complain regularly about missing buses, about buses coming in 2s and 3s and 4s. It is a situation and that is compounded by the fact that road traffic is actually back more strongly on some streets now than it was pre-pandemic because of people who are driving.
Shelley Carroll, I think I saw you nodding your head while he was saying that. You're in accord?
Absolutely. But it's a fraught conversation. It's fraught with tension on the part of the car drivers, because when you start to talk about transit priority lanes, it's really hard to get the word out there that you figured out a way to fit in the car lanes and that their journey isn't going to be changed before the hysteria takes hold. We experienced it recently in a rapid TO conversation that was about that, prioritizing some of the north-south bus routes so that we can maximize the impact of the crosstown, getting people down to them. But people zeroed in on one particular street where they don't want to see it, and we failed to have the discussion about the whole network. There already is a prioritized lane on Don Mills Road, for instance. Painting it red is not a huge change, but it underscores for people that might be trapped in a car and waiting in traffic, I could be zooming down that red lane on a bus right now. We really want to start to look at those things. And that conversation is we're underway right now with the rapid TO consultation, but we need the car drivers to really open their minds to how we can improve their car journey if we provide a better transit journey.
Shoshanna, I think I know how you're going to answer this question. You're going to say it can be done because you've been very optimistic about getting people out of cars and onto transit. But honestly, truthfully, do you think you can get people who live in the inner suburbs, more of them, to consider public transit as an option for them traveling around Ontario's capital city?
Absolutely. You have to make the service really good and you have to make it cheaper. Owning and driving a car is really expensive. It's a headache. And people only do it as their dominant mode if they don't have other good options. And this isn't just, I'm not speaking from optimism, I'm speaking from science. We are by no means the first place in the world who has wrestled with how do you manage mobility or accessibility or car use. We're not inventing this wheel from scratch. We know how to do this well, we just have to be willing to try. And there's a lot of increasing good evidence that people change their mind about travel and whether or not they want to drive or take public transit once they see the alternative. It's very hard to imagine how much better really great public transit is at serving everybody and how much better it makes it even for drivers who, because then, the last thing you want if you're using a car is everyone who prefers to bike to be in a car and everyone who prefers to be on public transit to be in a car. So people feel very protective of their road space, but the reality we've seen all around the world is once you actually put in a change, it's wildly popular.
Steve, in our last 30 seconds, I'll give it to you. Once we get past COVID and presumably, hopefully, once ridership does come back, do you think the TTC can build enough new alternatives quickly enough to keep up with what is anticipated to be greater demand going forward?
I don't think it's a question of building alternatives. I think it's a question of building on what's there already, running more of it, and providing better service. The idea that we need something brand new to make transit better, I think, is it's a false promise.
I want to say to people that I first met Steve Munro in 1982 when I was a City Hall reporter covering TTC meetings, and he was a gadfly sitting in the back of those TTC meetings, and as he reminds me, he'd already been doing it for 10 years when I just showed up for the first time. It's good to see you again, Steve. People can read your stuff at stevemunro.ca, and that's not spelled like Marilyn, it's spelled like the former Hamilton Cabinet Minister John. Shoshanna Saxe from the U of T and Shelley Carroll from City Hall, it's been great having the three of you on TVO tonight. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.